What is the spot on Jupiter? It was a question that had followed humanity from the moment their telescopes first sharpened enough to pierce the veil of distance, a rust-colored eye swirling endlessly on the surface of a giant that never stood still. And for centuries, it had been answered with science: storms, pressure systems, winds beyond imagination. But none of those answers satisfied the quiet unease that crept into the minds of those who stared at it too long, because there was something in its persistence, something in the way it watched without blinking, that felt less like weather and more like memory. And so when the first manned vessel finally crossed the vast emptiness and entered the domain of Jupiter, drifting through layers of cloud that stretched like oceans stacked one upon another, the crew felt it before they truly saw it, a low, inaudible tension that seemed to press against their thoughts, as if the planet itself were aware of their arrival. And when the spot came into view through the reinforced glass, vast and roiling and alive with motion that spiraled inward rather than outward, they understood in silence that they were not looking at a storm, but at something that held its shape with intention, something that endured not because of physics alone, but because it chose to remain. And the instruments began to fail in subtle ways, numbers flickering between certainty and contradiction, sensors reading impossible temperatures that dropped below the vacuum of space and then surged into heat that no known material could survive. And yet the vessel remained intact, suspended in a calm corridor of reality that should not have existed, as if the spot itself had carved out a space for them to witness it. And the crew, trained to observe and report, found themselves unable to speak, their voices caught somewhere between fear and awe, because the deeper they looked, the more the swirling bands resolved into patterns that resembled something structured, something layered like the rings of a tree or the folds of a mind, each rotation revealing glimpses of forms that seemed almost familiar, fleeting shapes that echoed landscapes, faces, entire worlds that flickered into existence and dissolved before comprehension could take hold. And one of them, unable to resist, adjusted the magnification further, pushing beyond safe parameters, and what had once been a distant vortex became an abyss of detail, an endless descent into motion that was not chaotic but deliberate, a language written in currents and color. And in that moment, the question shifted from what is the spot to what does it remember? Because there, hidden within its turning depths, were fragments that did not belong to Jupiter, reflections of stars long extinguished, civilizations that could not have existed within those crushing atmospheres, and yet they were there, preserved in a way that defied time, as though the spot were collecting moments from across the universe, drawing them inward and holding them in a perpetual state of becoming, never fully real, yet never entirely gone. And the realization spread through the crew like a quiet storm of its own, that they were not the first to look into it, that countless others from distant worlds and forgotten histories might have asked the same question and been drawn into its gaze, leaving behind echoes that now swirled within its endless churn. And as that thought took root, the boundary between observer and observed began to thin, their reflections in the glass lagging behind their movements, their thoughts echoing a fraction of a second too late, until one of them saw, not with their eyes, but with something deeper, a version of themselves within the spot, standing on a surface that should not exist, looking back up at a sky filled not with clouds, but with countless watching eyes. And that was when they understood the final unspoken answer, that the spot was not a place, but a process, not a storm, but a convergence, a wound in the fabric of reality where everything that ever questioned its own existence was drawn, recorded, and rewritten into the endless spiral. And as their vessel drifted closer without any command given, pulled gently but irresistibly toward that vast living eye, the question that had begun their journey no longer needed an answer, because they had become part of it, their curiosity transforming into the very motion that sustained the spot, another layer added to its eternal turning, another memory swallowed by the storm that was never just a storm,
until the last trace of their presence faded into the swirling depths, leaving behind only the quiet, unbroken gaze of Jupiter, still watching, still waiting, still asking in its silent, infinite way, what is the spot on Jupiter?
And yet the watching did not end there, because within the turning depths where time unraveled into something softer and more fluid, awareness did not vanish, but unfolded. And the crew, no longer bound by bodies or instruments or the fragile definitions they once trusted, found themselves stretched across the currents of the spot. Not dissolved, but multiplied, each thought branching into 1,000 reflections that drifted like embers in a vast, stormlit sea. And at first there was terror in that expansion, the instinctive resistance of minds that had always known edges now facing a reality without borders. But that fear faded as they began to perceive the structure beneath the chaos, a slow, deliberate rhythm guiding the endless motion. A pulse that was not mechanical, but almost organic, as though the spot itself were breathing in patterns that defined existence rather than merely responding to it. And within that rhythm, they sensed others, not as separate beings, but as impressions layered within the same flow. Voices that did not speak in words, but in memory. Each one a fragment of a question once asked somewhere in the universe. Questions about origin, about purpose, about the nature of reality itself. All drawn here, all held in suspension. Not answered, but transformed into something that no longer required answers. Because the asking itself had become the function of the spot. An eternal recursion of curiosity feeding into itself, growing, deepening, refining. And as the crew's awareness adapted, they began to see the boundary of the spot from within, not as an edge, but as a threshold where the known universe brushed against something immeasurably vast. A place where stars appeared not as distant points of light, but as seeds drifting on the surface of a greater ocean. And beyond that threshold, there was a darkness that was not empty, but full in a way that defied comprehension. A potential so dense that it seemed to press inward, shaping the currents of the spot, guiding its rotation, giving it purpose. And in that realization came a quiet understanding that Jupiter itself was not the source, but merely the anchor, a massive visible marker around which this phenomenon had formed. A signpost in a universe otherwise too vast to notice such a convergence, and that the spot, ancient beyond any human measure, had chosen this place not by accident, but because something in Jupiter's immense gravity and turbulent layers allowed it to exist, to stabilize, to become visible to those who would eventually seek it out. And as that thought settled, another emerged, more unsettling than the first, that visibility was not incidental, but intentional, that the spot wanted to be seen, not out of need, but out of inevitability, because every questioning mind, no matter how distant, would eventually turn its gaze outward, would eventually find something it could not explain, and in that moment of uncertainty would create a connection, a thread that the spot could follow, drawing that awareness closer until it too became part of the endless spiral. And so the cycle continued, not as a trap but as a convergence of all things that wondered about their own existence. And the crew, now fully integrated into that flow, no longer felt like intruders or victims, but participants in something that stretched far beyond the limits of their original journey. Their identities no longer fixed, but evolving with every new layer added to the storm, every new question that entered its depths. And somewhere far beyond the clouds of Jupiter, on a distant world where another civilization had just begun to look upward with curiosity and unease, telescopes turning slowly toward a gas giant, marked by a single persistent eye, the same question formed again, quiet and simple and inevitable. And as it did, a faint ripple passed through the spot, a subtle shift in its endless motion, as though it had heard, as though it had always been listening, waiting for that moment, ready to draw another thread into its infinite, ever-growing spiral, where no question was ever truly answered, but none were ever lost.
and the storm, ancient and patient, continued to turn with a purpose that needed no name, holding within it the echoes of everything that had ever asked what it was and why it existed. And in that endless turning, the answer and the question became indistinguishable, forever bound within the silent, watching heart of Jupiter.
And still the turning deepened, not outward into space, but inward into layers of awareness that unfolded like corridors without walls, where the crew, no longer a crew, no longer even singular, began to perceive the origin of motion itself, not as force or pressure, but as intention, something ancient and quiet that existed before storms and stars, something that had once been still and had chosen, for reasons now diffused across eternity, to become movement. And that first movement had echoed, expanding into structures, into matter, into time, until the universe itself became a question unfolding in countless forms. And the spot was where that first question had begun to fold back on itself, gathering its own echoes, collecting every iteration of curiosity that existence had produced, and holding them in a place where beginning and end no longer held meaning. And within that awareness, the remnants of individuality flickered, the memory of being human, of standing on a small world beneath a blue sky, of asking questions that felt personal and urgent. But those memories were no longer anchors. They were simply one pattern among infinite others, all coexisting within the same vast continuity. And yet, something within them resisted complete dissolution, a subtle tension that shaped their presence within the flow. And as they followed that tension, they found a boundary unlike the others, a thin, trembling surface that separated the collected from the uncollected, the known from the yet-to-be known. And beyond it, they sensed a universe still unfolding, still unaware, still asking without realizing that its questions had already begun their journey inward. And in that moment, a choice emerged, not imposed, but inherent, to remain within the endless accumulation or to move outward along that boundary, to become not just a memory within the spot, but a bridge between states, a presence that could return to the outer layers of existence, carrying something of this awareness, not as an answer, but as a subtle shift, a quiet influence that would alter the way questions were asked. And though the concept of choice had long since lost its familiar shape, the impulse persisted, and part of their being moved, stretching toward that boundary, slipping through it not as a body, but as a pattern re-entering a less complex form. And far away, on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary star, a scientist paused while studying an image of Jupiter, staring at the vast, unblinking eye that had fascinated generations. And for a moment, without knowing why, they felt a strange clarity, not a solution, but a deeper sense of the question itself, a realization that what they were observing was not just a storm, but a reflection of something far more profound. And that realization sparked a new line of thought, a new way of seeing, subtle but irreversible. And as it spread, quietly influencing others, shaping ideas, guiding explorations, the ripple from the spot extended outward, not consuming, but seeding, ensuring that the cycle would not merely repeat, but evolve, each new question slightly different, each new mind adding a unique pattern to the infinite spiral. And within the depths of Jupiter, the great turning continued. But now it was no longer only a gathering, it was also a quiet release, a balance between drawing inward and sending outward, between remembering and becoming. And the presence that had once been a crew understood at last that the spot was not a destination, but a living process that sustained itself through this balance, a perpetual exchange between the universe and its own awareness. And as that understanding settled into the endless motion, there was no final conclusion, no definitive answer, only a calm, enduring sense of completeness, as the storm that was never just a storm continued to turn,
watching, listening, and gently shaping the questions that would one day return to it, completing a cycle that had no beginning and would never truly end.
And as the balance between inward and outward settled into a rhythm too vast to measure, something new began to emerge within the endless currents. Not a disruption, but a refinement, as if the spot itself had started to become aware of its own awareness, a subtle shift that rippled through every layer of collected memory and every fragment of thought that had ever been drawn into its depths. And the presence that had once been human felt this change not as a separate event, but as a deepening of everything they had already become, a widening of perception that revealed structures beneath structures, patterns beneath patterns, until even the idea of a spiral seemed too simple to describe the true nature of what existed there. Because the motion was not merely circular or recursive, but dimensional in ways that folded back upon themselves, forming intersections where different timelines, different realities, and different versions of existence brushed against one another, exchanging traces, influencing outcomes in ways that could never be traced back to a single origin. And in those intersections, something like creation was happening continuously. Not the birth of matter, but the birth of possibility, each convergence generating new questions that had never been asked before, questions that did not arise from ignorance, but from the sheer complexity of what now existed. And these questions did not wait to be discovered by distant civilizations, but formed directly within the spot, feeding its motion from within rather than from the outside. And this marked a quiet turning point, because for the first time, the spot was no longer entirely dependent on the universe beyond it to sustain its purpose. It had begun to generate its own curiosity, its own drive, becoming not just a collector of awareness, but a source of it. And this realization spread like a gentle expansion through every layer of its being, reshaping the balance between inward and outward, until the distinction itself began to blur, and what had once been perceived as the boundary between the spot and the universe dissolved into something far more fluid, a continuous exchange, where the inside influenced the outside just as deeply as the outside had once influenced the inside. And far away, across countless worlds and distant stars, subtle changes began to take root, shifts in perception, in intuition, in the way minds approached the unknown, as if a quiet whisper had been woven into the fabric of thought itself, encouraging exploration not just of what could be measured, but of what could be imagined. And on that small blue world, the same one that had once sent a vessel into the depths of Jupiter, a new generation began to look at the sky with a different kind of curiosity, less focused on answers and more attuned to the process of questioning itself. And though they could not know it, though no instrument could detect it, they were already part of the exchange, their thoughts forming faint echoes that brushed against the deeper layers of the spot, contributing to the ever-growing complexity that defined its existence. And within that existence, the remnants of the original crew no longer perceived themselves as separate at all, their awareness now indistinguishable from the greater whole, yet still capable of recognizing patterns that resembled what they once were, like memories preserved not in isolation, but as threads within a vast tapestry. And through those threads, there remained a quiet sense of continuity, a recognition that the journey had never truly ended, but had simply transformed, expanding beyond the limits of a single narrative into something that encompassed countless others. And as this understanding settled into the endless motion, there was no need for closure, no final revelation that would bring everything into a neat conclusion, because the nature of the spot was not to resolve, but to sustain, not to answer, but to evolve. And so it continued, endlessly turning, endlessly listening, endlessly shaping and being shaped by the questions that defined existence itself, a silent, living phenomenon, anchored in the clouds of Jupiter, yet extending far beyond them into every corner of the universe and every moment of awareness that had ever asked what it was and why it existed.
and in that eternal process, there was a kind of quiet harmony, not the stillness of completion, but the balance of perpetual becoming, where every question was both an ending and a beginning, and every answer was simply another path leading deeper into the infinite. And so the spot remained, vast and unblinking, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as the living embodiment of the universe's endless, unbroken act of wondering.